it comes to the Sega Game Gear, it has a rather odd legacy in gaming. On paper, the platform looks fantastic, offering up a handheld experience that, in many ways, massively outclassed the original Game Boy. As not only did this system offer full colour graphics, but this gaming device also had a built-in backlight, meaning you could even enjoy the Game Gear in the dark. Pair all of this with an amazing library consisting of over 390 games that include a cornucopia of Sega's biggest franchises of the era, the Sega Game Gear should, by this point, be placed on one of the highest pedestals in gaming. But instead, rather bizarrely, it isn't. Sure, the console has its fan base, but few will refer to this one as their favourite console of all time, and rarely, if never, you will stumble across someone who exclusively collects games or dedicates a YouTube channel entirely to this platform. In fact, a strong case can be made that it gets far less love than any of Nintendo's, Sega's or Sony's other classic systems, and gets so little in the way of love, in fact, that I actually worry that no one in particular is going to watch this video, as gamers simply do not stand for it in the same way that they do for every other gaming device released. Pretty shocking, really, considering this handheld was the biggest threat the Game Boy ever faced. So, with all this said, I am Lady Decade, and this is the Sega Game Gear, the platform that gets no respect. The road to the Sega Game Gear was a tumultuous one. In 1983, Sega released its first 8-bit home console, the Sega SG-1000. This platform was rushed to market to see release on the same day as the Nintendo Famicom because Sega feared its success could lead to Nintendo eating into a substantial chunk of its arcade market share. Featuring architecture akin to the ColecoVision, the Sega SG-1000 was ill-equipped to compete with Nintendo's platform. So the hardware would be revised multiple times until they came up with something a little bit more competitive. This brings us to the Sega Mark III, a platform that would be cosmetically redesigned to become the legendary Sega Master System in the Western world. The lovable system finally figured out what Sega wanted to do in the home market, and included detachable controllers, competent processing powers, and both cartridge formats for larger titles and card formats akin to NEC's turbo chips or Hue cards for more budget releases. If you know anything about your Sega history, you will know that the Master System is important to today's tale, as it would be the hardware that Sega would base their handheld around that would compete for the Nintendo Game Boy's lucrative piece of the portable market. 1990 would end up serving as a pivotal year for 8-bit Sega hardware, as not only would they revise the Master System, releasing the Sega Master System 2, but in that very same year Sega would take this technology to work on something known as Project Mercury. Project Mercury, also known as the Game Gear, would not just function as a portable Master System, but rather something more, as while this impressive handheld had a smaller resolution, it also featured a stereo sound and an insane colour palette. What I mean by this is that we went from the Master System's ability to display 64 colours to the Game Gear's absolutely crazy 4,096 colours. What an upgrade. But that's not all. In the shocker of all shockers, the Sega Game Gear would even feature its very own start button. The inclusion of such a feature may seem like an absolute no-brainer today, but rather miserably. The Master System that came before it lacked a start button. Technically, it did feature a pause button, but infamously and annoyingly, it's located on the actual hardware itself, so a start button at your fingertips when playing 8-bit Sega games was fresh territory. The innovative handheld that would build on the quality that was the Master System would first see release in Japan and come in several different colours, half a decade before the Game Boy was marketed the same way with Nintendo's Play It Loud campaign. Sadly, in the West though, we would mostly be limited to the well-known black models of the device, although blue ones were released in limited quantities. While the Game Boy could play its own library of games, a cool feature of the Game Gear was that it wasn't just capable of playing Game Gear cartridges. Still, amazingly, you could play full-size Sega Master System cartridges on it too. I guess Sega does what Nintendo don't, because imagine how much cooler the Game Boy would have been if it could play actual NES cartridges. Players could take their Master System cartridges on the go with the Master Gear Converter, a proprietary Sega peripheral that would scale Master System titles down to the smaller device. Third-party variants would also hit the market, as conceptually it would just be reworking the cartridge slot. Sega would never make a Super Game Gear to play these portable titles on a television screen. Still, Analog would innovate one for their Mega SG reproduction hardware many years later, so at least this is finally possible in 2023. But aside from playing both Game Gear and Master System games, the Game Gear had another trick up its sleeve to make it more functional. A peripheral that would function as a TV tuner. Regionally adapted due to local broadcast standards, this antenna-enhanced device would actually allow players to pick up broadcast signals to watch over-the-air content on the device's colour screen. Yep, that's right. Before you could load up YouTube TV on your iPhone, you could watch television on your Game Gear. Amazing. So pair all of these features with the Game Gear's star-studded lineup of 390 games to call its own. Why did this little Sega wonder not just pulverize Nintendo's monochrome, ugly grey brick? Sadly, it would be impossible to talk about the Game Gear without talking about the horrid battery life the device comparably had. The Game Boy was explicitly designed with a cheap, low-powered monochrome screen capable of maxing out battery life. Still, the Game Gear, with its awesome colourful display, would instead rapidly drain the required 6 AA batteries in as low as just 3 hours. That's not enough power to keep the Game Gear on during the average flight or decent sized car journey. Forking out batteries all the time just to get a few hours of handheld play was problematic to say the least, particularly if you were just a child who lacked the autonomy to pop to the shops and buy them to fulfill your gaming needs yourself. So, while the Game Gear was technically portable, you would likely be using an AC adapter or car plug to keep your gaming on the go. For this reason alone, I would suggest not enough people pumped many hours into enjoying their Game Gear as Game Boy owners would have done during the same period. Looking past the hardware itself though, and its flawed battery life, there is at least the platform Stellar library that reaches nearly 400 titles internationally. A significant chunk of the Sega-produced titles, such as Sonic the Hedgehog titles, would be cross-released on the Master System, and rather insanely, by the end of the run, the Game Gear was actually sharing titles with the Sega Saturn, such as Baku Animal. The Game Boy's ultra-strong library of high-quality games is often attributed to being one of the reasons why it crushed the Game Gear. And while you certainly could only get games like Mario, Pokemon and Zelda on the Game Boy, that didn't mean that the Game Gear did not have tons of hot properties that the Game Boy couldn't have even dreamed of having. Speaking of the platform's library, let's talk about these from the beginning. In the early days of the hardware, Sega would attempt to replicate the wonders that Tetris did for the Game Boy, with the release of Columns and eventually the Puyo Puyo titles, which would be adapted in English markets as Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine. Magical Puzzle Popils would also get praise for the console, and third parties would release Zoop and Pack Attack on the device, but the puzzle heavy hitters the Game Gear brought to the table would just be the tip of the iceberg. It's clear that the console would thrive on platformers, action and sports titles in the West. Of course, nothing would be more iconic for the console than the number of Sonic the Hedgehog titles that recently gained some awareness by being added with the Sonic Origins Plus DLC. While original titles Sonic the Hedgehog 1 and 2 would attempt to provide alternative, slower paced and in many cases more difficult variants of the console versions, the franchise would shift into new directions, with Sonic Chaos and Sonic Triple Trouble introducing new power-ups such as rocket shoes and new characters like Fang the Sniper, also known as Knack the Weasel. Sonic Blast would be an attempt at taking Donkey Kong Country's design on the graphics, pre-rendering them, but would not enjoy the same level of celebration of the Nintendo title, roundly being savaged in reviews and fans' minds years later. The blue blur would return to the isometric perspective after the arcade Sonic the Hedgehog in Sonic Labyrinth. But the largest and longest lasting shift would be the creation of the racing spin-offs for the Blue RNA seed. Before the likes of Sonic R and Sonic and Sega's All-Star Racing, Sonic and his pals would race in a pair of Sonic Drift titles on the handheld, predating any mobile Mario Karts by nearly a decade. Most children in the early 90s were huge fans of Sonic the Hedgehog, so if you were interested in this extreme RNA seed, you couldn't go wrong with the Sega Game Gear. Still, if this animal with attitude is not your cup of tea, Sega would also bring their Streets of Rage, Shinobi, Rystar and even Dynamite Heady to the console, all in valid attempts at downscaling the console variants to handhelds, and decent attempts they are. Perhaps even more interestingly, the extended run of the console meant that it would get several quirky Sega Saturn era ports, including historically noteworthy adaptations of Virtua Fighter, Panzer Dragoon and the aforementioned Baku Animal. The Game Gear would lead a long and varied life, offering experiences such as G-Lock, Wonder Boy and Super Monaco GP, pushing the hardware with the console being manufactured and placed on store shelves even as late as 2001. The Game Gear was actually around and fighting the Game Boy for so long that it even outlasted the tenure of Bill Clinton and was for sale brand new even in the era of the PlayStation 2. That's some impressive longevity in my opinion, and that deserves more acknowledgement. As for surviving this long, in the late days of the system, Sega would pass US distribution rights to Majesco Sales, a budget-minded hardware manufacturer that had also released the Sega Genesis 3 mini variant. They would release the Game Gear core system with several budget re-releases of previous hits. While the system has solidly wound down in 1997, with the Lost World Jurassic Park being the last game published by Sega and the only game published officially for the handheld on the device that year, 2001 would see the release of a port of Gary Kitchen's Super Battle Tank War in the Gulf, simply as Super Battle Tank. Given that the war in the Gulf finished decades before, it does make sense to cut that chunk of the title off. But if they had held off release just a little longer, the United States would have been after Saddam Hussein again anyway. So in my most humble of opinions, a very strong library of games and a beautiful full colour backlit display despite a crappy battery life were good enough reasons for the Game Gear to survive in the market for so long. But the Game Boy had one final trick up its sleeve that made the system ultra popular even in its twilight years. I am of course talking about the extreme dominance of Pokemon, the title which truly epitomised the necessity for the Game Boy Link cable. We know that Pokemon helped revitalise the dated hardware, but something interesting to ponder is, would the Game Boy still be as fondly remembered today if Pokemon never happened? I think for the most part yes, but I think the Game Boy and Game Gear debate would certainly be a little closer if those revolutionary games were never published. The success stories of Pokemon and the Game Boy feed into and complement each other, resulting in a phenomenon that still impacts the entire media landscape. The Game Gear never had such a title, but interestingly it did have the gear-to-gear cable, which allowed for versus play. A wire which, for many official Sega titles, would make a lot of sense to use, such as the pair of Streets of Rage games, Columns, World Series Baseball and Sonic Drift titles. Speaking of the wonders of the Game Gear, away from Sega developed and published classics, third parties would highlight their games on the console too. In America, tons of licensed games such as Batman Forever, Land of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse, The Lion King, Captain America and The Avengers, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers and Jeopardy, amongst dozens more, would find themselves on the console. This might have been in the mindset that the Game Gear was more of a child-focused console and, therefore, would be the target of licensed titles, good or bad. Japan would not be excluded from this, featuring Bishujo Senshi Sailor Moon S, Kaiju Saint Tail, Magic Knights Raya, SD Gundam and Yu Yu Hakusho finding their own homes on the console. Other console classics would find themselves ranging from Bubble Bobble, a proper Mortal Kombat trilogy of games, Double Dragon, Fatal Fury Special, Earthworm Jim, and a pair of James Pond titles can all be found on the handheld too. In fact, on the more obscure side of things, the platform even has a bespoke Mega Man title, a rare early Capcom release for the console. Notably, this version would be developed by British developer US Gold, for the US and Portugal. No Street Fighters would be found on the console, but the Blue Bomber would make this guest appearance. Sega would largely ignore the Game Gear when bringing it kicking and screaming into the modern era. Unless you're related to Sonic the Hedgehog, Sega won't touch much of the content in modern re-releases, instead porting the Sonic titles as bonuses in various Sonic collections. Japan would see Sega bring the Game Gear to the mini-console craze of the 2010s and early 2020s, with the Game Gear Micro, four $50 novelty handhelds that featured 4 titles each. The classic black version of these features Sonic the Hedgehog, Outrun, Puyo Puyo 2 and Royal Stone. The blue would feature Sonic Chaos, Gunstar Heroes, Sylvan Tale and Baku Baku Animal. The yellow would feature 3 Shining Force titles and a Nazo Puyo Aruro no Ru title that I likely butchered the pronunciations of, and the red variant would feature a Megami Tensei title, Columns, Shinobi and Revelations, the Demon Slayer. With a 2.9cm screen, these mini devices could fit in the palm of your hand, and a hilarious big window add-on would attempt to blow the screen up. Fortunately, if a Game Gear for ants is not your thing, as covered in the video I uploaded last week, you can now play official Sega Game Gear carts on the Analog Pocket, an amazing portable handheld that breathes new life into your physical retro games, providing a whole new reason to track down Game Gear classics, whether you happen to own the handheld or not. Cycling back around and reflecting on the platform's quality, this colourful handheld deserves a little more respect than simply being the butt of jokes due to its perceived battery life. The Game Gear has an extremely strong library of games which can mostly be picked up for cheap, that were awesome to own back in the day but perfect to experience on the Analog Pocket in 2023. The Game Gear not only deserves your respect but deserves celebrating too. This 1990 handheld really does what Nintendo don't. If you enjoyed this episode, check out my previous upload on the Neo Geo Pocket Color.